Well, I think I can finally say that I can prove God. And please analyze this video and tell me if I got anything wrong, okay? So I found out that I learn a lot from doing debates or conversations. Lots of times it's a conversation because, you know, I'm not trying to force someone to believe. I'm just telling them why I believe. And so I had one this past Friday night, and so I had some main thoughts, and so I want to share those with you. And so in order for life to exist, you have to have functional proteins and the DNA, the recipe for those proteins. So would you agree with that? All right. That in order for there to be life, you have to have functional proteins and you have to have the functional recipe for those proteins. So protein synthesis, I believe, is the problem with atheism, along with binary fission. You know, how was the cell programmed to reproduce, to split? So let's focus on protein synthesis. So protein synthesis is when the recipe for a specific protein is brought to a ribosome and then turned into that functional protein. And so if we look at the RNA world hypothesis, you've got RNA that self-replicates. It can be folded to become a ribosome, which can just do some very basic functions of an enzyme. Is that useful? But to get to where it needs to go, there has to be functional proteins, and RNA is not a protein. And so if the functional protein, so if you think about this, that proteins would have to come about without protein synthesis, without the recipe and the ribosome, right? So we would have to have proteins forming before that process formed. You understand that? And so if proteins formed without the process of protein synthesis, without the recipe and the ribosome, well, then how did the recipe get in the DNA? So in other words, it wouldn't matter. So if you have a protein that forms apart from DNA being used, well, then there's no recipe, there's no record of that and how to reproduce it, how to make it again. And it's so unlikely, it is astronomical, that a functional protein would form without protein synthesis, because it has to be a specific number of amino acids. They have to be all left-handed amino acids, and they have to fold properly. And so it's very unlikely that a protein would form. But if it did form, well, it wouldn't matter, because if that cell reproduced through binary fission, then the protein would be in that one cell, because the recipe was never recorded into the genetic information of that cell, or that protocell trying to become life. And then the amazing thing is that ribosomes, that are the factory for producing proteins, which I'll provide a link to a great animation of ribosomes creating proteins, links of amino acids. Proteins, the most simple ribosome is made of 55 proteins along with RNA, and it's mostly RNA. But you got 55 proteins. So it's crazy unlikely. It's crazy improbable that one protein could form by itself. But in order for you to have protein synthesis, you would have to have 55 proteins, not random proteins. You'd have to have the 55 proteins that make up a ribosome along with the RNA to form. And then even that would be nothing, because then you've got to have those 55 recipes in the genetic code. So you see, this is a coordination. There has to be a recipe for a recipe for proteins, including the proteins and ribosomes in the DNA. And then there has to be the ribosome to make use of that recipe, to make that recipe into a functional protein. And I'm saying that for that process to start, you would need simultaneously the DNA to arrange itself in the proper sequence necessary to produce these functional proteins. You'd have to have the recipe writing itself, alongside you would have to have the proteins necessary for a ribosome to form simultaneously. Because if it was just the proteins forming without the recipe, then it wouldn't matter, and it would never happen again, because it has to be in the code. Because if this cell split, and the code was copied, and the two daughter cells had the genetic code, but that genetic code did not have the recipe for these proteins, for ribosomes to do protein synthesis, then it wouldn't matter. So there's the problem with atheism, and that's how I believe I can prove God, is that in order for life to come about unguided, without a mind, so it might be better to say mindless abiogenesis instead of unguided. And by the way, I do not think that natural selection applies to chemical evolution, because chemicals don't care. Chemicals are still chemicals, whether they become something complex or not. All right? Where in biological evolution, natural selection does matter, because the organisms that survive are organisms, right? They have something to lose. They can lose life, but a chemical can't lose a chemical. It's still a chemical, right? So I don't think natural selection applies to chemical evolution. So back to the main point is I don't think you could have this. It's crazy. It's crazy to think that one protein could form, but you would have to have the recipe for 55 proteins, and those 55 proteins would have to reproduce, or would have to form unguided without a mind, and they'd have to arrange themselves into a ribosome for their recipes to produce, along with the ribosome, to produce more proteins from more ribosomes, so that you could have protein synthesis. And then you'd have to have any other functional protein. That recipe would have to be in the DNA. You understand that. A functional protein is nothing, because proteins don't reproduce. You've got to have the recipe in the protein, the recipe for the protein in the DNA. And then that wouldn't matter without the proteins to form a ribosome to turn that protein recipe into an actual protein. So here is the problem with atheism, and this is why I believe I can undoubtedly prove the existence of some type of creator. All right, is that you will not have a simultaneous, unguided, mindless creation of these amazing, specific, long recipes. The average protein, I believe, contains at least 200 amino acids. All right, so that wouldn't form, the recipe won't form, and then the actual amazing mechanism of the ribosome made of 55 proteins wouldn't form, and it'd have to be simultaneous. And so I believe atheism is dead. Of course, people are going to believe it. People don't want to believe what I'm saying. People want to believe that there is no creator, but I think this undoubtedly proves that there is a creator. Because if you look at protein synthesis, you look at a ribosome, and you understand that a ribosome by itself is nothing without a recipe. And you've got to have the recipe for the ribosomal proteins in that recipe, or else it will never happen again, right? So I hope you're honest with yourself. I hope you're rational. But please critique me. Please comment if I'm wrong about anything, because I want to know that I'm wrong, and I can make a new video and change it. And please watch this simulation of a ribosome that I will provide a link to.